Hi everyone. Today we're going to take a small departure from the usual topic of conversation. Instead of talking about tanks, we're going to talk about their greatest nemesis, the anti-tank gun, particularly the British 6-pounder. The history of the 6-pounder begins in 1938 when the infantry tank Mark II, which was later known as the Matilda, arrived on trials. The British Director of Artillery realized that if the UK can build a tank that can withstand the fire of the 40mm 2-pounder, which was Britain's best tank and anti-tank gun at the time, then, well, so can anyone else. Most importantly, the Germans. And so he launched the new anti-tank gun, which would reuse the 6-pounder or 57mm caliber that was already in use in the UK earlier. The official name of this gun was the 6-pounder Ordnance Quick Firing 700 weight. Work on this gun actually paused right at the beginning of World War II when it turned out that the British 2-pounder gun was perfectly fine against German medium tanks. They only had up to 30mm of armor, which was really no problem for the 2-pounder. It wasn't until later in 1941 when there were first tests against improved German tanks with applique armor were carried out that it turned out that the 2-pounder actually can only penetrate the front of a Panzer IV with extra armor welded on at about 500 yards, which was considered insufficient. And so, thankfully, this gun was already in development and could be produced not only as a towed variant, but also as a tank gun. So the Churchill 3 had it, the Valentine, starting with the Valentine 9 had it, the Crusader 3 had it, so it was a fairly, the Cromwell and Centaur and that family of tanks actually also had it at the beginning, so fairly common weapon in around 1942. The interesting thing about this gun is that it wasn't only produced in the UK. The Americans actually got a license to build it as the 57mm anti-tank gun M1. And the interesting thing about that is that the Americans built a copy of the Mark I gun with a 50 caliber barrel. The British actually built the 57mm 6-pounder Mark II, which had a slightly shorter barrel, 43 calibers, because the longer the barrel of a gun is, the more difficult it is to produce. And so you had these two guns, that very similar guns that were being built by these two nations. So the British quite liked this gun, both as a tank gun and an anti-tank gun. Unfortunately, its value was reduced by the fact that it had no HE round. There was actually a lot of work put into developing one, so one of the things that was tried was reusing a 57mm 1000 weight. This was a naval gun. Reusing the shell from that. Trials showed that this was an okay solution, but it required a number of different fuses to engage different targets, and the HE effect was still actually kind of weak. The experiments actually dropped off because it turns out that the best solution was to install a 75mm gun on the same mounting that the 6-pounder used, and so all the British tanks just transitioned to that, and there was no point in developing a new HE shell. So despite this anemic HE performance, the AP performance was actually quite good. Trials against Tiger tanks in North Africa showed that you could penetrate the front armor at up to 500 meters thereabouts, and the side at actually up to 1.5 kilometers. So this was a very effective weapon against Germany's newest tank. And actually Tiger 131, the one that you could see in Bovington today, that was disabled by Churchill tanks that were firing 6-pounder shot. The 6-pounder was also quite effective against the Panther. Obviously couldn't penetrate the front sloped armor, but it could penetrate the front of the turret, so the gun mantlet, about 400 yards, so give or take 350 meters, with APC, armor-piercing capped ammunition, and it could penetrate the side at something like 2,000 yards. APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot, more expensive, less accurate, but much more effective ammunition, was also developed and used extensively in 1944 onwards, but that's a bit further out than the era that I'm going to cover in this video. Recently, I was lucky enough to train in artillery drill with the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion reenacting group at the Swords and Plowshares Museum in Ottawa under the command of retired Major Michael Calnan. And so enjoy this video of operational 6-pounder gun of firing black powder blanks.
Silver wagon! 200 meters! Load!
On it! Tracking!
Engage!
On!
On!
On! All the way down.
So the Americans and the Commonwealth armies weren't the only ones using these 6-pounder guns. The USSR actually also received 400 American M1s through the Lend-Lease program. I'm not entirely sure how many or if any 6-pounders came from the UK to the USSR, but even 400 American guns isn't nothing. These guns arrived in 1942, and they went through trials. Unfortunately, the conclusions from the trials were quite poor. So since the ZIS-2, the 57mm anti-tank gun, was no longer in production at the time, they were compared with 3 Soviet weapons. The 45mm M42, so the lengthened 45mm gun, the divisional ZIS-3 76mm, and a experimental IS-1 57mm anti-tank gun, which was similar to the ZIS-2, but it had a shorter barrel and it was lighter. So the conclusions were quite unfavorable for the American gun. It's penetrated at normal up to 78mm of armor, which was actually just a hair more than the 76mm divisional gun, the ZIS-3, and the 45mm gun. The penetration was a lot lower than the Soviet 57mm gun, even the IS-1 with the shortened barrel. So, not a great performance. However, there's a bit of a catch. The penetration drops off very quickly, and it drops off faster than the 76mm ZIS-3, which makes sense. The heavier you round, the faster, the more energy it retains. But it also lost energy faster than the 57mm gun, and actually even faster than the 45mm gun, which would have used a much lighter round. And so this makes me suspect that there's something weird going on with ammunition, with the ammunition for it. Maybe it didn't have a cap or something like that. Unfortunately, I don't have the details of this trial. What I do have is the experiences of the tankers. And the tankers were quite happy, actually, with their 6-pounder guns that were used in Churchill tanks and Valentine tanks. In trials against the Tiger tank, both the Soviet ZIS-2 and the British 6-pounder penetrated the side of the tank at a range of up to 1,000 meters. Now, it could have penetrated at a longer range, but this wasn't tested. The British 6-pounder was also tested against the Ferdinand. Here it performed a little bit worse. It could only penetrate the sloped side, the 82mm superstructure at 300 meters, and it could no longer penetrate at 500 meters. Unfortunately, I don't have data of the ZIS-2 against the Ferdinand. It appears that it was not tested even in field trials, which is quite unfortunate. The only thing I have to go on is the instruction on how to combat the Ferdinand, which says you should fire these ZIS-2 at the sides from 1,000 meters. Now, if you hit the vertical side armor, that's the same as a Tiger, so it's definitely going to go through. But again, no data about how it would perform against the superstructure. Generally, we can probably say that the Soviet 57mm ZIS-2 and the British 6-pounder performed roughly the same. Since the tankers found the performance of these tank guns satisfactory, there was a lot more of them shipped to the USSR than there were towed anti-tank guns. So there were 928 Valentine Mark 9 and Mark 10 tanks shipped to the USSR, and 238 approximately Churchill 3 and Churchill 4 tanks. I say approximately because figures about how many Churchill 2 tanks with only 2-pounder gun differ. How many of those were sent to the USSR? Those figures differ depending on the source, but about 238 Churchill Mark IIIs and Mark IVs. Tankers in the field recall that the 57mm gun is perfectly adequate against enemy armor, even against heavy tanks such as Tigers. So I can only conclude that given a fair chance, the 57mm towed gun would also have performed admirably on the level of the ZIS-2, but unfortunately, since its initial review was quite poor, only a small number of these guns were ordered. Nevertheless, the scenes reenacted here by the 191st Rifle Division in operating a 57mm anti-tank gun could very well have taken place during the Great Patriotic War.
Огонь! Огонь!